Join the DL 500 Club today at patreon.com/DavidLand to get exclusive content. This new Indy 500 rule has changed everything. Racer Magazine's Marshall Pruitt broke this story today that Joseph Newgarden's maneuver under the pit entry line, which you will see based on the dotted line on the racetrack, will be banned starting with this year's Indianapolis 500. Now, it's important to note because there's already been a lot of confusion online about this, at least based on the interpretation that is given in the article, and until we have further clarification from IndyCar themselves, we won't know this for sure, but it sure does seem like this move does not ban the snaking maneuvers that we have seen in the finishes of the 2019, 2022, and 2023 Indianapolis 500s. This rule only applies off of the fourth turn and only below that dotted pit attenuator line. Now, all that being said, this rule change is, for me, I'm very, very happy with it. Extremely happy with it. I'm very, very glad that a reasonable decision was made. A decision was made quickly, and a decision was made to essentially save the drivers from themselves. Because, as we'll talk about throughout this video, the Indy 500 and the finishes of the Indy 500, especially last year, a lot of problems that have kind of been bubbling under the surface for a little while kind of all came together at one time and created not only a controversial finish, but a finish that kind of, I would say, I feel confident saying this, kind of, I would say, hurt the credibility of the event. I mean, you still see people talking about it and questioning it. Some complaints more reasonable than others, I would say, but there are a whole lot of reasonable complaints to be made about the Indy 500 finish last year. And one of the most reasonable ones was that pretty much everybody who is sensible and has a brain looked at two cars diving well below the pit entry line, in which the speed limit is, I believe, 60 miles an hour right now, and flying headlong at almost 220 miles an hour at a pit attenuator barrier that we have seen drivers unintentionally hit it, and the results are catastrophic. So a lot of people saw that, myself included, and said, if the worst case scenario ever happened and someone were to hit that head on at full speed because they followed another driver down underneath the pit attenuator line, and especially with the way the racing is nowadays, you've got a stack of 20 cars bearing down on whichever car gets bounced back across the track from hitting the pit attenuator on the last lap. And that's just the kind of calamitous accident that just would not fly under any circumstances, probably in a year. Those are the kind of things that you would worry would be a sport ender, not just an Indy 500 ender. So you have to be reasonable and look at something and go, that was a ballsy move, Joseph Newgarden. There's no doubt about that. You were willing to literally do whatever it took to win the Indianapolis 500, and you went to the extreme end of breaking the draft and preventing Marcus Ericsson from passing you before you got back to the start-finish line. Props to Joseph Newgarden. His ballsy maneuver won him the Indianapolis 500, but much like, and I got to give Nick Yeoman credit for this on Twitter, much like the Hail Melon at Martinsville in the NASCAR Cup Series a couple of years ago, that was a bridge too far. And yes, it was, you respect that the driver was willing to do that, but cooler heads in the months after have prevailed, and that move is banned. Now, there is a potential side effect here, and I'm sure many of you have already talked about it. We're going to be using the word NASCAR a lot throughout this video, unfortunately, and trust me, we'll get to that part and why that kind of bothers me about the Indy 500, that we're using that word. But when you start saying drivers can't go below a certain line, it sure does dredge up a lot of feelings and thoughts about the yellow line rule in NASCAR and races potentially being taken away, and particularly the biggest race of them all being taken away because you put a wheel or two below a line on the last lap or anywhere throughout the race. And then you get to the question of, would there ever be a situation where someone would be forced below that line? And then what is the rules clarification there? And if the rules clarification is the same one that NASCAR used, then you're talking about potentially people turning other drivers to get back up from underneath that line. There is a bit of a slippery slope that might, kind of result from this, given the current rules package and how the Dallara DW12 has raced ever since 2012. I mean, you're really not going to change it very much. We'll also kind of delve into that a little bit deeper when we kind of get into some of the other things about the Indy 500 and where it probably needs to go as an event. But I think on a whole, I think that this rule change had to happen because you're saving the drivers from themselves, and you're also kind of, yes, there were a lot of fans who cheered, right, all of the nonsense last year. But me being me and knowing myself and the race that I love so much as well as I do, I can't remember a time that I left the Indy 500 with as much of a bad taste in my mouth as I did at the end of 2023. And maybe that's just because I'm young, because, again, my first Indy 500 was 2002. Literally anything could have happened in that race, and I probably would have gone home happy that I had seen an Indy 500. So you talk about the controversy at the end of 2002, maybe that was worse. I couldn't tell you. All I know is I had a good time as a kid. But as an adult, you watch that race, and especially the finish, and you see all the things that were happening, and it gave me an odd feeling. And I think I even said that in my post-race video. You guys might have gotten the sense from that post-race video kind of where my feelings were. And I tried to self-censor myself, because you can't just in the moment make a lot of proclamations and judgments about something. You got to sleep on things. So, I wanted to make sure my immediate reaction was not like overly critical or something like that, because I think, again, I stated in the video, Joseph Newgarden, deserving winner of that race. Definitely the fastest car, definitely the best driver, won that day. But if you're Marcus Ericsson, I feel like you feel very, very differently about that. We know Marcus Ericsson feels differently about that given his post-race comments. But it's not the only rule change that needs to happen. And I think that's where kind of we need to continue on this discussion about the end of the Indy 500, because I think this is an incredibly positive step in the right direction of correcting a lot of that bad feeling that I and a lot of other fans, whether we're a silent majority or not, had about last year's Indianapolis 500 and the way it finished. Because I think it's really important to note, and I don't know if I've said this before, I think I might have said it on the David Land podcast, I might have even said it in the post-race video from the Indy 500, but you're never going to be able to out NASCAR, right? You look at the Daytona 500, and the Daytona 500 especially, but really NASCAR in and of itself has like a core nugget of its former self inside, which keeps a lot of people like me coming back and watching. But what NASCAR has turned into, especially over like the last 20 years, has essentially become the Ricky Bobby version of NASCAR brought into reality. I mean, literally, Will Ferrell should be the Grand Marshal of next year's Daytona 500. With the way that Fox was covering the Daytona 500 and the silly, stupid stuff that seems to happen every year, even in a race that, relatively speaking, was clean and a lot of actual racing happened like this year, it still turns into a joke at the end of it, and that's all that anybody ever remembers. And that's kind of what this year's Indianapolis 500, or 2023's Indianapolis 500, was very much like. Even Tim Cindric in the post-race press conference, I'll never forget him saying this, that the Indy 500 has kind of turned into the Daytona 500. And I was like, oh my God, that's like doomsday scenario from that perspective. So the other rule that needs to be changed is the red flags. And to that, I would say there just needs to be a rule written, because right now it's the abandonment of procedures, amendment in the rules where they, IndyCar officials can just throw out all the rules if they want to and just say, well, we're going to red flag it and go green with one lap. If you're going to do the red flags, and you've been doing it for 10 years, yes, there's been a precedent set. I hate it as a purist. I despise it as a purist. But you've set a precedent. Now you need to write a rule. It just needs to be on the books. It needs to be written, and it needs to be clear and spelled out before the race so that we all have an expectation of what the race is going to be if things happen the way that if things play out the way they did last year, which was pretty much the worst case scenario in terms of the amount of there was certainly one reasonable red flag with the big crash in turn 2. Arguably, Pado's was a reasonable red flag, but I think the final crash, which should have just ended the race, was an unreasonable red flag. Now, there has been some rumors that there will be a clarification made to this rule, and I sure hope that actually got done, because it's been discussed, as far as I know, in IndyCar's circles and with the teams and with the drivers. But I hope, and I don't know, I hope a consensus has been made and a rule will be on the books, because, from my perspective, I think if I was writing a rule, the cutoff point would be we can't throw a red with 5 laps to go. If it's 5 laps to go and there's a yellow flag that requires more than 5 laps of cleanup, the race is going to end under yellow. If we can get it cleaned up quicker and safely before the end of 5 laps, maybe we can throw the green. But that should never happen again, where cars are coming out of the pits for a 1-lap shootout. That was one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen in my whole life. And frankly, we were really lucky that there wasn't some enormous crash, because I think that's the other thing I would say about a red flag rule for me. Limiting it to 5 laps or more, where you throw an entertainment red flag. You got to give the drivers opportunity to sort themselves out. These 1-lap shootouts they don't work in open wheel cars. It's not NASCAR. You can't outdo it NASCAR, and you can't outdo NASCAR when you're doing 35 miles an hour faster than they are. It's just a recipe for disaster. And all of that chaos at the end of the race, I think, hurt the credibility of the event. Yes, a lot of people cheered. Everybody knows that everybody cheered the red flags, or at least a lot of the crowd cheered the red flags. But I think the Indy 500 crowd isn't buying their ticket. The ticket decision is not made on the last 2 laps of the race. It's everything else. It's the time spent with family. It's the time spent with friends. It's the nostalgia. It's the other 198 laps of exciting action that hopefully is taking place. You can't compromise the entire event just to manufacture a finish. NASCAR's already doing that, and if you want to see that race, it's coming back this year. It's called the Brickyard 400. That's how I feel about it. The other thing that everyone's talked about, getting away from the red flag discussion, is the banning of the snake entirely, which is the weaving to try to break the draft. That's a really tricky and slippery slope, and I don't think they can do it under the current rules package, because reasonably thinking about the fact that the DW12 chassis, whatever aero kit you want to put on the car, races in a very similar way. It doesn't matter what aero kit's on it. Doesn't matter how big the wings are. It's pretty clear that you're a sitting duck if you're the leader. The twin turbocharged V6s are 12 years old, just like the chassis. And there's been a lot of development made, a lot of strides made. But for the most part, the teams, the drivers, and unfortunately the fans are beginning to understand the pattern and understand how the race plays out, because more often than not, the race plays out the exact same way every single year. And so I think the only way you break the snake is a ground up, clean sheet of paper, rule set, new chassis, multiple chassis, whatever you want to call it. However you want to make that solution happen, you need something new, because the DW12 is going to race the way it races, and you're not ever going to be able to change it. You weren't able to change it with the original aero kit. You weren't able to change it with super high downforce aero kits, manufacturer aero kits, and now the super low downforce aero kit. They all kind of race similarly, right? So that's a new chassis thing. And whenever a new chassis comes, you'll probably see the snake go away, because it's a very refined package right now. Everybody, the engines are making as much power as they're probably ever going to make. The aerodynamics are extremely efficient. The chassis setups are extremely dialed in. The field's closer than it's ever been. And that means they're all going to run around in a line and fuel save for about, 150 laps of the race. To me, that's one of the big problems with the Indy 500 this year. It's too standardized. It's too, we know what's going to happen. And that's a bad combination. I think that the leapfrog racing too. I mean, obviously that's a big part of the DW12, but the strategy is predictable too because the engines have made the same amount of power for so long. You know, about 30 to 33 laps, everybody's going to come in. They might race for a couple laps, then they'll get right back in line. There's no advantage necessarily to lead the race because you're just going to burn more fuel than everybody else. So you get situations like happened last year where RC Anderson is a lapped vehicle and the leaders literally let the lap car, get past them so they can break the draft and just sit in line and fuel save. To me, I would really love an opportunity to see that go away in some capacity. And the hybrids might help that, by the way, whenever and hopefully whenever the hybrids are introduced. That might actually affect how the engines are making fuel or fuel mileage, or at least throw a couple of wrenches into the strategy to break things up a little bit. Because to me, the best IndyCar racing, the best racing in general, but especially the best IndyCar oval racing, takes place when the faster cars can pass the slower ones, and the slower ones aren't quick enough to get anywhere near the fast cars. Because I think what you have now, and I know I'm messing with fate here right now by saying this, but you have a situation with the way the Indy 500 works out right now, where you could end up being like the NASCAR Daytona 500. All it takes is one crazy rain shower, and a 20th place car and a 20th place driver who has saved one extra lap of fuel than anybody else is lap 101 at +1 away from an Indy 500 win that pretty much everybody is going to know is undeserving. So I hate to be that tough about that in a video where I'm positive about a change, but there are a lot of things right now that kind of created that perfect storm of 2023. And it's not just the fact that the drivers are willing to weave below the pit attenuator. Though I think this is a great step in the right direction to get IndyCar and the Indy 500 back where the Indy 500's, the unpredictable, exciting race that we know it is. And frankly, it still is. But I think it's going down the path where I was very worried about it leaving the 2023 Indy 500, because I was like, this is a trend-setting race. This is how it's always going to be. And it's good to see that IndyCar's taken a few steps to get it away from that, at least for now. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. I got passionate, but I get very, very passionate about the Indy 500. So I hope you appreciate that, and I'll see you in the next video.